So, thanks everyone. This presentation is sort of an ever-evolving talk from my honours thesis that Steve mentioned. But this one in particular elaborates on the concept of the ecological self. So, yeah, it's all kind of embedded in deep ecology theory, which I was hoping it wouldn't overlap too much with John Seed's, but I think we've got some different angles covered here. So I just had this quick next slide, just sort of a map of the territory, because we always have these titles to talks, and what's that about? So mapping is just basically a philosophical inquiry. It's essentially just like a picture of the terrain that we're talking about. But Entheogenesis itself had a beautiful description by the late great Ralph Metzner as the growing realization that we human beings and the world around us are much more than simple material organisms living and evolving on a material planetary body. We are multi-dimensional, spiritual, cosmic, noetic, psychic, and physical beings. So the ecological self describes a mode of being able to perceive and experience all living things as inseparable from our individual and collective embodiment. So it encourages us to explore our affinities with other beings as part of our own humanity. So the attempt here is to provide an overview of how and why conceptual and experiential aspects of the ecological self might bring about a richer awareness and being in the world. So going back to deep ecology, and particularly ecosophy. So it's a philosophy originally conceived by Arne Naess and George Sessions in 1973, and it expounded upon by many others since, including the esteemed John Seed. Essentially, it's a call for a reawakening and understanding of earth wisdom, which is that word ecosophy, through personal introspection, purification, and harmony of being. So an ecosophy or an earth wisdom is any philosophy or ecological harmony or equilibrium that Naess explained requires us to examine our personal and collective shadow and the reasons why we're here. So inspired by Naess's own spontaneous eco-epiphanies and spiritual experiences in nature, as John alluded to, he emphasised the critical importance of the perception of gestalts, or networks of being, relationships in the greater web of being, so that when deep gestalt experiences occur, a strong identification with non-human life is arrived at through awareness of our inherent strong identification and interconnectivity with it, so that we protect it as if it is our own self. So as a consequence of recognising this interrelationship with the living earth, a heightened sense of empathy starts to arise, and a natural inclination to protect non-human life to the point at which obligation and coercion to protect it should be unnecessary. And this is what would be compared to as shallow ecology. In this case, it just comes as instinctual and self-evident. We'll go, if we've got time, we'll quickly go over a little bit of the theoretical structure of deep ecology. So at level one at the top there, we have sort of the ultimate premises or norms, belief systems from which all action stems. These are our individual ecosophies, whatever they may be. They occur in many different religions, spiritual and philosophical belief systems. Any view of the world can be called an ecosophy, and philosophical, spiritual, religious standpoints. They're all seen as equally effective, if not authentic, means of changing existing structures and patterns of unsustainability. Religious spiritual beliefs go from Buddhist and Christian traditions. They exist alongside philosophical ones, such as those espoused by Spinoza and Whitehead. These are all examples of ecosophies. So really, any belief system that posits an ecocentric perspective would theoretically fit here. Ecosophies often take the form of non-anthropocentric belief systems. They inevitably and naturally include those of indigenous traditions. So the ecological wisdom here may be embedded in unbroken lineage or a revitalised post-colonial tradition. So level two there is the 8 platform principles, which are descriptive and prescription functions. And it was these I chose as my methodology to look through the ayahuasca.com forums textual descriptions that would match with the philosophy of deep ecology. So I used these 8 principles as a sort of, thematic analysis to identify that. The principles in themselves are not singular or final expressions. They can easily encompass the vast scope of social, political, and ethical formulations that may overlap with deep ecology, and these principles act as means of underlying divergent but underlying philosophical premises. So as a formulation, these underlying tenets are at the heart of deep ecology. They allow for a variety of paths to the same points. So consequently, encompassing a critique of anthropocentrism that transcends cultural boundaries. At level 3 there, we have hypotheses and views about global states of affairs, which logically directs the level 4, practical decisions about ecological actions to be taken in different contexts. So there, that's a sort of summary of the principles. It's not the actual 8 principles themselves. I found this on the net and thought it was a bit of a nicer, conciser version. So I'll leave that there for you to read while I sort of run through it. But out of the sort of first 3 or 4, it gives you a real feel for the core principles, which expose the embodiment of 2 really key concepts. The first is called biocentric egalitarianism, which is basically an ethic of equality that affirms because all organisms and entities in the world are part of the same interrelated web of life, they're therefore equal in their own value and worth. So Bill DeVale and George Sessions explain this idea of biotic equality as intimately related to the all-inclusive self-realization that if we harm the rest of nature, we're harming ourselves. And this outlook stems from, or the outlook stemming from this is then called metaphysical holism. And in many traditional indigenous cultures, this is already recognized as the spirit moving in the nature of, in all of nature and in all living things, and of seeing other living things as our kin. This sense of interrelated, cooperative interdependence then comes to support a type of bioregionalism, which Freya Mathews described as an embodied relationality and reciprocity with one's immediate local biota community and the places and practices that support it. So bioregionalism envisions social and cultural life and the whole life world community is intertwined through the spirit of place, or the genius loci. And this may be possibly getting close to what Indigenous people of Australia would call sense of country, I think. But happy to be corrected on that by Indigenous people here. So consequently, through solidarity between human and non-human life, we acknowledge that the value of our relationships to the natural world takes place in place. And it must be grounded in information and experience in order for us to discover our affinities with other beings as part of our own humanity. So the development of deep ecology rests primarily on this process of self-realization, taken up as an ongoing, comprehensive, deep inquiry into our values, the nature of the world, and the self. It involves any spiritual growth or unfolding that leads to an identification that goes beyond humanity to include the non-human world. So Arne Naess originally expressed this idea with a capital S, as you'll see, in self. This distinguishes the larger ecological self from the small s individualistic, individuated egoic self. And the exclamation point is used to denote that this is not a mere description, but that it says something that ought to be. For us humans, this idea of self-realization is tied to the development of a wide identification in which the sense of self is no longer fixed, but it encompasses greater and greater wholes, and should therefore encompass the self-realization process of all other beings. Naess noted that at any given moment, there's multitudes of both human and non-human selves arriving at their own realization. It seems a strange concept, but I guess it's like a fish is being the best fish it can be. You know, it's being its utmost beingness. It's full potential. So the other life forms in the ecosystem are engaged in their own processes of unfolding and striving for their own actualization. So one of the integral aspects of coming to this wide identification is the process of deep questioning, which begins through self-confrontation, self-examination, and interrogating the conditioned cultural beliefs and attitudes that may be influencing our perspective and behaviours towards the world. By deep questioning, an individual is conceiving a total view of life that can begin to inform and guide conscious and pragmatic choices. It's this action that distinguishes deep ecology from other ecological philosophies, making it more of a movement than merely a philosophy, and one that has global cross-cultural applicability. So getting to the ecological self, this is a concept expanded on by subsequent deep ecological philosophers like Arne Naess, Freya Mathews, Val Plumwood, Bill Duval, and the great John Seed, who used Naess's idea of wider identification. And Naess had explained that the ecological self of a person is that with which this person identifies, defining identification as a spontaneous, non-rational process through which the interests of another being are reacted to as our own interests. So the authors conceptualizing this ecological self describe a sense in which the boundaries between self and other are dissolved, which I'm sure many of us can relate to. And this happens through a sensory experience informed by a phenomenological shift of perception. And yeah, in a nutshell, how the psychedelic experience often manifests. Yeah, so deep ecology has been critiqued for being a perennial philosophy. A lot of people don't like perennial philosophies for some reason, because it draws on and stems from a variety of traditions that embrace non-dualism, animism, pantheism, and holistic views. Deep ecology has, in this sense, become, as Christian Greer put it, a contemporary manifestation of a primordial metaphysics. So grounded in Huxley's book of the same name, which I absolutely recommend everyone to read, a perennialism refers to those ever-relevant, inexhaustible themes of mystic gnosis as being the highest common factor of all theologies and traditions. It represents the notion of direct experiential access to universal archetypal truths that transcend the boundaries of culture. So common to perennialism, deep ecology, and psychedelic praxis are an implicit revitalising of our understandings and respect for Indigenous knowledge systems, which can further assist in reconnecting individuals and communities to the sacrality of nature. Yeah, perennial gnosis is commonly experienced in the psychedelic space because the experience is cross-culturally perceived as providing access to some sense of universal, transcultural other, or to a global, universal, timeless, and even divine other. Perennial philosophy, as has been described, is a global religion of primal ancient lineage encompassing diverse, nature-beneficent cultures and lifeways, and as such underpins the notion of a paradigmatic shift, which is clearly essential in redirecting the ecologically destructive path of modern industrial growth societies. So the potential of psychedelic substances to enhance and transform human relationships to the natural world can be said to occur through this invocation of a numinous noetic sense of sacredness and a greater than self, or an ecological self. Richard Doyle, author of Darwin's Pharmacy, offered us this term ecodelic to describe the actions of psychedelics in manifesting a broad and interconnected sense of being, in which distinctions between subject and object and environment are eroded, and a transpersonal self is invoked. Interestingly, eco, at its Greek root, means dwelling place or household. So ecodelic could be thought or could be read as manifesting a sense of home. Doyle also explained how the psychonaut is involved in a densely interconnected ecosystem for which contemporary tactics of human identity are simply insufficient. So when distinctions between subject and object, or self and other, are eroded, and a transpersonal self is invoked, It's said that the boundary-dissolving sense of interconnectedness, oneness, or unity with nature and reverence for the natural world is one of the most commonly reported experiences with psychedelics. Now, I would say this is predicated greatly on whether it's taken indoors or outdoors. I don't think that's likely to be occurring as much in indoor therapeutic sessions as it is in retreats outdoors, but we'll come to that later. It's further been noted by writer David J. Brown that the invocation of a numinous noetic sense of sacredness and greater self is often catalysed by a long-term evolutionary perspective on our current historical situation, by seeing beyond the present into the deep time of evolution in order to consider the real roots of consciousness and our role on this planet in this particular time, as he wrote in the MAPS bulletin dedicated to psychedelics and ecology, which I encourage everyone to check out. As part of this deep questioning process, experiences of an ecological self help to undo the hierarchical binaries we come to know as human and non-human, self and other, spirit and matter, nature and culture, such that nature comes to be understood as a series of subjects and not just utilitarian objects. The ecological self invoked by these states helps us to understand that the dominant perception of our human species is somehow superior in the great chain of being is an inherently flawed one. So the psychedelically invoked ecological self can therefore become a lens through which we can, as individuals and communities, begin and continue to critique all anthropocentric positions. So one of the most widely reported transpersonal events with psychedelic substances is the encounter with plant consciousness, where plants convey a sense of agency, psyche, or indeed spirit. This direct experience of vegetal intelligence shows us that plants are aware, purposeful, and actively responsive. Even though biological science is only just beginning to recognise the sort of sensory and communicative capacity of plant life, the notion of plant sentience is an epistemological position that's still a little bit beyond the pale for dominant Western science, although Monica Gagliano is doing a wonderful job in breaking those moulds. In this way, psychedelic plants are often referred to by the cultures that use them in the feminine and masculine as eternal beings with personhood, subjectivity, and agency, and they exist in a position of relationality and kinship. Bia Labate and Clancy Kavanagh remark that this is most clearly evident in the perception of ayahuasca as La Madre, and the very voice of Mother Nature, or Pachamama, and more recently Gaia. But if plants are understood as sentient, then why not all matter? Why not panpsychic view, in which stone, water, fire, air, those things previously seen as unliving, all contain consciousness? It's another way of understanding our earthly reality, and perhaps equally as valid. Philosopher and activist Val Plumwood called this a philosophical animism, in which encounters with the larger-than-human world of organic and inorganic life reveal it as having intent and purpose, and therefore inherent value. There's a great quote from anthropologist Gerardo Raquel Domatov on the ayahuasca ritual, that it is an explicit dialogue with nature, a lesson in ecology. It gives nature a chance to voice its complaints and demands in unmistakable terms. And I like to think a few of us here have had that experience. This type of translinguistic communication is a central feature of shamanism, in which humans can transform into animals within the ayahuasca realm through a constant shifting between species and embodiments. As Richard Doyle also explained, there are non-human entities whose appearance is linked to the disappearance of the self. This experiential communication deeply resonates with ayahuasca shamanism's relational, intentional, conscious, and communicative entering into with other than human autonomous personalities. Again, the appearance and direct dialogical contact with non-human entities in the psychedelic space further appears predicated on the disappearance of our socially and culturally constructed selves or identities, biographical identities in particular. So psychedelics have thus become prototypical methodologies with which to merge the internal ecology of the mind with the external ecology of the natural world, mediated by forces culturally attributed to both the agency of plants and the property of its pharmacological constituents. So whether you believe in the spirit or the pharmacology, it's most likely both, and a beautiful combination of both. So, though many here may be familiar with the state of being, it feels pertinent to point to the very typical and classically psychedelic visual perceptions involving infinitely recursive fractal structures such as neurons, veins, branches, rivers, dendrites. These micro and macro expressions of elements in nature appear as one surface indicator that points us towards an understanding of the continuity of form in life. On the physical level of matter, the human body is composed of the same elements as the rest of the natural world, so that even in death, our material bodies decompose and rejoin the organic ecosystem, in turn giving life and becoming part of other organisms. And in life, we are wholly dependent on the energy exchange of a simultaneously living ecology. If we suppose that mind arises from matter, what this reveals is an inherent continuity of being in which the human form is merely a reflection of a wider process and part of what is often called the whole Gaian organism. Philosopher Gregory Bateson called this an ecology of mind, noting the way in which consciousness changes and forms patterns, both on a social and individual level, likening mind to an ecosystem, with ideas being the flora and fauna of the system. And this union of the internal ecology of consciousness with the external ecology of the natural world, it exemplifies Naess's description of Gestalt interactions, networks brought to awareness by psychedelically invoked ecological-self, which can then be seen as enabling the concrete contents of reality and its abstract structures to be comprehended together, which allows for its intrinsic value to clearly emerge. Further, this new heightened appreciation for natural aesthetics derived from experiences with psychedelics in nature also suggests another path toward the fundamental appreciation of the diversity of wildness and of unspoiled wilderness and all of its inhabitants. So exploring the notion of an ecological self is brought about by psychedelics. Another slide, there we go. Offers us a way of mapping our own process of entheogenesis by highlighting the significance of these states to present a view of our existence as relational and holistic. Psychedelic experiences of an ecological self appear to consistently implicate a way in which we are able to identify with the infinitely broader non-human biotic community and consider the role of human consciousness within it, all the way to its seemingly infinite edges. So while the concept of ecological self and the deep ecological philosophy it stems from appears to exemplify a type of perennialism, this has its critics who rightly point out that all experience, even psychedelic ones, are culturally mediated, all the way from expectations prior to the experience, priming, to the expressions during it, and then to the post-interpretive stage, or what we might call integration. Nonetheless, many accounts of these experiences stress the transcendence of time and space, which can often extend into the transcendence of cultural boundaries as well. I would posit here that increasing transculturally consistent psychedelic experiences, such as those revealed by accounts of 5-MeO-DMT, are beginning to exhibit more uniform continuity, which is revealing some type of transculturally, universally human peak experience. So such peak experiences are often accompanied by a following reorientation towards our deepest intuitions about life on transculturally consistent experiences of more than an ecological self, but a non-self, and the realization of our entailment with the ecology of living organisms around us and our entanglement within it. So while the branches of the perennial philosophy are many, the images and ideations experienced through these non-self states of psychedelics have been shown to reliably facilitate an ecological self that therefore implicates a novel way in which we're able to identify in a timeless manner with the broader non-human biotic community of consciousness. So thank you for your time. Thank you to the EGA and to the amazing crew.
Thanks so much, Jeff. That was fascinating. We've got some time for questions, if there are any questions from the audience.
Hi, great talk, by the way. So I don't think anyone doubts that increasing a sense of ecological self more worldwide would be of great planetary and human health. Do you think that there's potential for other practices that might dissolve the ego to some extent in terms of like increasing?
Absolutely, and that's why I sort of thought it pertinent to keep that apron diagram there, because at that top level, all the different methodologies that encompass, meditation, and as John mentioned in his talk, the Council of All Beings, they developed, that, and I think a few other sort of methodologies to bring people to a similar state. And even other things like holotropic breath work and the other modalities we have that are non-psychedelic can definitely bring us to that same place. And I kind of feel that with all the focus on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, we really need to start building a framework for psychedelic-assisted nature experiences.
Right.
Because, I've met people through work at the APS and they say, I'm really incredibly depressed, I need to microdose. And I say, well, when was the last time you went to the bush? Never. They're just living in apartments in the city, they go to work, get some food, they go to their apartment and watch Netflix, and that's all they do. And so you've got to get out in the bush, and that will alone increase your mental health.
Great. Thank you.
Any more questions? Yeah. Thank you.
Hey Jeff, great talk. I was just thinking, if psychedelics move people from like the egocentric to the ecocentric, and given the kind of ecological crisis we're in at the moment, isn't it like our prerogative to give people like Gina Reinhardt or convince her to perhaps try something like this?
Well, yeah, if only we could. And I mean, Jesus, of all people, what she does, she really should be under duty to have that experience. It just seems so obvious that what she does, how could she do that without having this experience? And particularly now that she's in the world of developing psychedelic substances and cannabis, and she's taken her slice of the trend pie. Yeah, she's invested a lot of money in psychedelic research and, drug development and legal cannabis development, and yeah, it's kind of sickening, really.
Another question over this side.
More of a comment. I was just before I came here, I was watching Douglas Rushkoff next door, and he made something that didn't surprise me, but was still quite surprising in its way. That they'd wired up some billionaires to a bunch of electrodes and so forth, and shown photos of children suffering and stuff, and that bit of empathy that would light up in anyone else is completely absent in extremely wealthy people.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, given that they have got to that wealthy position through sociopathic behaviour.
Yeah. They've switched it off and it's pretty much gone.
Yeah.
Another
I
question
imagine
here.
most politicians are the same.
Yeah, I think the comment about Gina Reinhardt and so on is really raises an important question, which is, we're seeing psychedelics co-opted, obviously, for financial purposes, ego, so on and so forth. And I guess in terms of the hopes we might have for people moving towards ecological self and ecological awareness, there will be this tension between this version of self that has been dominant in the West and throughout much of the world for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and yeah, the ecological self we might like to move them to. And I guess I'm wondering, what do you see as the greatest risks or the barriers towards that transformation, and the potential for co-option there?
I think I know what you're trying to get at. I'd say I see the risks as minimal. Really, if they have an experience of dissolving and becoming one with nature, I don't think that's going to be too hard to come back from. It might be a bit of an ontological shock for someone like that, yeah. They might need a bit of, integration and post-experience therapy and helping to land, because it would be such a cognitive dissonance with their previous state of mind, if that's what you're sort of getting at. But yeah, I mean, I see it's pretty low risk, really. I mean, it's not like dealing with trauma, say, in a psychedelic. It's just a therapy session which requires, some real skill and real, monitoring and so forth. It's basically just giving someone the experience of merging with the greater whole. Yeah, I see it's pretty low risk, really.
Just one last question quickly down the back here, Jeff.
Hi. I love the comment that you made about just returning back to nature, and how often we're living in communities. We're not really communities, but city lifestyle, boxed apartments or boxed houses and so forth. I'm quite new to this conference, but something that I did notice over the last couple of days was the reference of integration of self and VR. I'd love to see your comment on, because I'm hearing your presentation on the ego and the eco and the self and all of that. I'm probably not formalising my statement properly, but I'm wanting to see, how do you see our merging of self with merging of nature with merging with VR? Is there... Sorry? Yeah, with technology.
Yeah. I'm a little bit sceptical on VR, personally. I haven't looked at it enough, clearly. And I can see its utility. But I think moving deeper into that world of artificial metaverse is probably not the best direction. It's going the other way, going back into unspoilt nature, how it's been for, hundreds of thousands of years. The VR will always be just a replication of something else. It'll never be a real thing in and of itself. But yeah, sure, it has applications and it has some wonderful sort of, tools and tricks that can be used, as Speaker for us demonstrated. But in terms of an expanded sense of self and nature, it has to be nature. There's no other, substitute for nature. We only have one planet.